Hello from Rio de Janeiro. This is a story of how British legal aid was used for a tacky inheritance dispute in Brazil. A city banker turned film scriptwriter had convinced himself that his brother, 5 local witnesses and a Brazilian notary had forged his father's will, and that he stood to lose his share in a £1 million apartment in Copacabana. He decided to start an action against his brother, but instead of choosing Rio de Janeiro, which was an obvious choice, he decided to start litigation in London instead. The story continues in London. He found a firm of West End solicitors who secured legal aid funding to pursue his claim. However, they conveniently forgot to inform anyone about the legal aid funding, which is strictly against funding rules. Neither was legal aid mentioned at the assessment hearing at the courts behind me. This denied the defendant 2 opportunities to nip this malicious litigation in the bud. The plaintiff abandoned the case a day before it was to be heard in the High Court, but not before considerable legal costs had been racked up. When the defendant attempted to reclaim his legal costs, he discovered that he could only reclaim a fraction thereof because the action had been started on legal aid, which means that you, the British taxpayer, have ended up funding most of this Brazilian inheritance dispute.
My name is Philip Coate, and I'm an English solicitor. Since 1970, I have worked in Brazil, where I am registered with the Brazilian Bar Association as a foreign legal consultant. And during this time, I have worked closely with leading Brazilian law firms in both São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Jointly with my Brazilian colleague, Marcos Montenegro, I have provided services over the last few years for an English client in connection with a long-running dispute with his brother, who accuses him of having benefited from the alleged forgery of the will of their father back in 1992. I'm familiar with the procedure under Brazilian law for the making of wills, the formalities for which are extremely rigorous. In this case, the will was executed by the father in May 1992 before a notary public and in the presence of no fewer than 5 witnesses. 3 of these witnesses have since been traced and have made sworn statements to the effect that there was absolutely nothing irregular throughout the will-making procedure. It is therefore extremely difficult to imagine how this will can have been forged. The Brazilian lawyer acting for my client's brother informed him, quite frankly, that there was no evidence whatsoever to support his claim that the will had been forged. And he also told him that the chances of persuading a Brazilian court to the contrary were extremely slight. This advice, however, did not deter my client's brother from issuing proceedings against my client in the High Court in London, for which he managed to obtain legal aid. The fact that legal aid had been obtained was communicated neither to my client, nor to my client's solicitor, nor to the court, nor was it mentioned at the pre-trial assessment hearing. In fact, my client only became aware of the grant of legal aid some years later on the occasion of the costs hearing, when he discovered that he would only be able to reclaim a small portion of his costs. In a case like this, where it later transpired that the facts were not exactly as presented to the Legal Aid Board, either because the claimant's solicitors had overstated their case, or the client himself had misled them, then one would normally presume that the Legal Aid Board would be prepared to investigate, to make sure that the criteria used for judging legal aid applications had been complied with. But not in this case. The Legal Aid Board simply refused to investigate on the grounds that too much time had passed. In fact, I find it truly amazing that the Legal Aid Board, in view of the apparent lack of evidence in support of this claim, should have agreed to fund the case in the first place. This case, in my opinion, represents a miscarriage of justice and, at the very least, a gross misuse of British taxpayers' money.
If you think the Legal Aid Agency should investigate how funding was secured for this frivolous no hope of winning inheritance dispute in Brazil, click here.